Have you ever stood in front of the one person who was supposed to love you no matter what and watched them choose someone else? I have. I remember that day like it happened 5 minutes ago. Not 5 years ago. 5 minutes. Because some moments don't fade with time. They burn themselves into you. They become part of your bones. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is what happened to me. Because if you're watching this, maybe you felt it too. Maybe someone you trusted, someone who was supposed to protect you, chose comfort over you. Chose someone new over someone who had been there since the beginning. This is the story of how my father looked me in the eyes and chose his new wife over his own daughter. And this is the story of what happened after. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the daughter they pushed aside was not going to stay down. She was going to rise. Quietly. Patiently. And when she came back with the truth in her hands. Stay with me till the end, because this story doesn't just have one twist. It has 3. And by the time you reach the final section, you'll understand why they say the quietest people carry the loudest storms inside them. Before we go further, I want you to remember one thing as this story unfolds. I never wanted revenge in the way people imagine it. I never wanted to destroy my father. All I wanted, in the beginning, was for him to see me, to choose me, even once. This story is about what happens when love is ignored for too long, and what that ignored love turns into when it has nowhere else to go. I want you to picture something for a moment before we begin. Picture a house, warm and lived in. The kind of house where the smell of dinner lingers in the hallway and photographs cover every wall. A family frozen mid-laugh, mid-hug, mid-ordinary moment. The kind of photographs nobody thinks to take until years later, when those moments are gone and all that's left is the picture. Now picture that same house, years later. The photographs are gone, replaced with something more modern. The smell of dinner is different. Someone else's recipes now, someone else's rules about what belongs in that kitchen. And somewhere, quietly, in the smallest room at the back of the house, a girl who used to belong there now feels like a stranger in her own childhood. That's where this story begins. Not with a scream, not with a slammed door, but with something quieter and in some ways, far more painful. The slow, deliberate erasure of a daughter from her own father's life, replaced piece by piece by a woman who had done this before and would very likely have done it again if no one had stopped her. Let's go back. Back to before the storm. Back to when I still believed my father would always be my father first. Before I tell you about the woman who changed everything, I need you to understand what my family was like before she arrived. Because you can't understand the depth of a fall unless you understand the height it fell from. My parents were not a perfect couple. No couple is. But there was a warmth in our small house that I didn't fully appreciate until it was gone. My mother was the kind of woman who hummed while she cooked. My father was quieter, a hardworking man who believed that showing love meant showing up. Every school event, every late night when I was sick, every small moment that most people forget, but children never do. I was their only child. And for the first 14 years of my life, I never once doubted that I was loved. Not once. Then my mother got sick. I won't go into the painful medical details, because this isn't a story about illness. It's a story about what came after loss. But I need you to know this. My mother's passing broke something in my father. The man who used to laugh loudly at his own bad jokes became a man who sat in silence at the dinner table. The man who used to hum along with my mother's cooking now barely ate. I was 15 when she passed. And in the years that followed, it was just the two of us, my father and me, trying to rebuild a life out of the pieces that were left. I won't lie to you. Those years were hard. But they were also, in a strange way, some of the closest years my father and I ever had. We leaned on each other. He taught me to drive in an empty parking lot on Sunday mornings. I learned to cook the meals my mother used to make, and he ate every single one, even the ones that turned out badly, because he said it reminded him of her. I remember one Sunday in particular, about a year after my mother passed. My father woke me up early, before sunrise, and told me to get dressed. He wouldn't tell me where we were going. We drove for almost an hour in silence, the radio low, the sky slowly turning from black to gray to a soft orange. He took me to a small hill just outside town, a place my mother used to love, and we sat there together and watched the sun come up over the fields. He didn't say much that morning. He didn't need to. We just sat there, side by side, and for the first time since the funeral, I felt like the two of us were going to be okay. I felt like grief hadn't destroyed our family. It had just changed its shape. I held on to that morning for years afterward. The way you hold on to proof that something good is still possible even after something terrible has happened. I thought that bond was unbreakable. I thought grief had welded us together in a way nothing could undo. I was wrong. Because 3 years after my mother passed, my father met a woman named, for the sake of this story, let's call her Diane. And Diane did not walk into our lives quietly. She walked in like a wildfire. And by the time I understood what was happening, everything my mother and I had built with my father was already starting to burn. At first, I was happy for him. I want to be honest about that. I saw my father smile again for the first time in years, and some small part of me thought, maybe this is good. Maybe he deserves this. I didn't know then that being happy for someone and being safe with someone are two very different things. I remember the first time I met her. My father brought her to dinner at our house. Nervous in a way I hadn't seen him since before my mother got sick. He kept glancing at me throughout the meal, silently asking for my approval. And in that first dinner, Diane was perfect. She complimented the meal I had cooked. She asked me thoughtful questions about school, about my friends, about what I wanted to study. She laughed at the right moments. She even brought up my mother, gently, saying she had heard wonderful things about her and that she would never try to replace her. I remember thinking, that night, that maybe things were going to be okay. Maybe my father had found someone kind. Maybe our family could grow again instead of just healing around a wound. It took almost a year for me to understand that the woman at that first dinner and the woman who eventually moved into our house were not entirely the same person, or rather, that the woman at that first dinner was a carefully constructed performance, and the version that emerged afterward was closer to the truth. Diane was charming in the way that predators are charming. She knew exactly what to say to my father, exactly when to laugh at his jokes, exactly how to make him feel like the only man in the world. But with me, when my father wasn't looking, her eyes would change. Just slightly. Just enough for me to notice, but never enough for me to prove. Small comments started. Oh, you cook just like your mother did. How sweet, in an old-fashioned way. Small exclusions started. Family dinners where I somehow wasn't told the time changed. Small manipulation started. My father slowly, quietly, being pulled in one direction while I was pushed, inch by inch, in another. I told myself I was imagining it. I told myself grief made me sensitive, made me see threats where there weren't any. I wanted so badly to believe that my father's happiness and my own security could exist in the same house. But 6 months after they started dating, Diane moved in. And that was when the real story began. There's a particular kind of pain that doesn't come from one big moment. It comes from 1,000 small ones, stacked so quietly on top of each other that by the time you notice the weight, you're already buried under it. That was what living with Diane felt like. She never screamed at me. She never hit me. If she had, at least I would have had something clear to point to, something my father couldn't ignore. Instead, she did something far more effective. She rewrote the house, piece by piece, until there was no space left in it for me. My mother's photographs, the ones that used to line the hallway, slowly disappeared into boxes in the garage. We're just refreshing the space, Diane told my father, and he nodded, because by then, nodding was easier than asking questions. My room, which used to be right next to my father's, was suddenly the one Diane wanted to turn into her home office. I was moved to the smaller room at the back of the house, the one that used to be storage. My father apologized when he told me, but he didn't stop it. Dinner conversations changed too. Diane had a way of steering every conversation toward herself, her opinions, her plans for the house, for my father's finances, for their future. And whenever I tried to speak, she had a gentle, practiced way of interrupting that made it seem like she wasn't interrupting at all. That's interesting, sweetheart, but let me just finish this thought with your dad first. Every single time I started eating in my room, my father noticed less and less. Not because he didn't love me. I have to believe, even now, that some part of him still did, but because Diane had become an expert at redirecting his attention. Every time I tried to talk to him alone, she would appear. Every time we planned something, just the two of us, something would come up that needed his help instead. I remember one night, maybe 8 months after she moved in, I tried to talk to my father about how disconnected I felt. I chose my words carefully. I didn't want to sound jealous or dramatic. I just wanted him to know that I missed him. He listened. For a moment, I saw something in his eyes, recognition, maybe even guilt. He started to say, I know things have been different, And then Diane walked in with 2 cups of tea, sat down right between us, and changed the subject to a home renovation project she wanted to start. My father's attention shifted instantly, like a compass finding true north. And I sat there, my sentence unfinished, watching my father's face light up over kitchen tiles while my heart quietly sank. There was another tactic Diane used that I didn't fully recognize until much later, once I had the vocabulary to name it. She would occasionally, in front of my father, say something kind about me, genuinely kind, warm even, and then, days later, when it was just the 2 of us, reveal a completely different attitude. I remember once, at a family dinner with my father's co-workers, Diane told everyone at the table how proud she was of her stepdaughter for maintaining good grades while working part-time. My father beamed. I felt, for a fleeting moment, something like hope that maybe she really did care. 2 days later, alone in the kitchen, I mentioned that I might need to borrow the car for an extra shift that week. Diane's expression shifted instantly, the warmth of the dinner completely gone. You know, she said, her voice light but pointed. Most girls your age have already moved out and stopped depending on their parents for everything. I just think it's something to consider. I stood there, stunned, the contrast between her public praise and private criticism so sharp it took my breath away. This became a pattern I eventually understood as intentional. Create just enough positive public moments that anyone questioning her motives could be dismissed. But she said such lovely things about you at dinner, while doing the real work of erosion in private, where there were no witnesses and no way for me to prove what was actually happening. It's a particular kind of manipulation that leaves the victim doubting their own perception of reality, because the public version of events never matches the private one, and there's no one around to confirm which version is true. I started keeping a private journal during this period, not because I planned to use it as evidence someday, but simply because I needed somewhere to write down what was happening so I could look back and confirm to myself that I wasn't imagining it. Looking back at those journal entries years later, during the process of building my case, I was struck by how consistent the pattern was. The same cycle of public warmth and private coldness, repeated so many times it could hardly be called anything other than deliberate. That was the pattern for the next 2 years. Small moments of hope, always followed by Diane's quiet, practiced interruptions. I started to understand that this wasn't an accident. This was a strategy. Diane wasn't just building a life with my father. She was systematically erasing me from it, one small moment at a time, so slowly that my father never noticed the process, only the result. I want to tell you about one specific day because I think it captures everything about that period better than any general description could. It was my 18th birthday. In the years before Diane, my father had always made a big deal of my birthday. Not extravagant. We never had much money for extravagant, but meaningful. He would take the day off work. He would make my favorite breakfast, badly, because he never quite got the recipe right, but he tried every single year. It was tradition. It was one of the few things that had survived my mother's passing completely intact. That year, my 18th birthday fell on a Thursday. I woke up expecting, out of habit more than anything, to smell something burning in the kitchen and hear my father's off-key humming. Instead, the house was quiet. I came downstairs to find a note on the counter in my father's handwriting. Sweetheart, Diane has a work event I need to support her at today. We'll celebrate this weekend. Love you. Dad. We did not celebrate that weekend. Diane had planned a couple's getaway for her and my father that had, according to her, been booked for months. A detail I found suspicious even then, since I had never heard either of them mention it before that week. My father apologized. He promised we'd do something special when they got back. We never did. Not that year. By the time they returned, life had simply moved on, swallowed by the next thing Diane needed his attention for, and my birthday became a footnote that nobody quite got around to. I didn't say anything about it at the time. I told myself it was a small thing, a scheduling conflict, nothing worth making a fuss over. But small things, when they repeat often enough, stop being small. They become the shape of your whole relationship. By the time I turned 19, I felt like a guest in the house I grew up in. And that was before the real betrayal happened. Because everything I've told you so far, the small exclusions, the disappearing photographs, the interrupted conversations, all of that was just the setup. What came next was the moment that broke everything wide open. The moment my father had to choose, clearly and directly, between his daughter and his new wife. And he chose her. I need to tell you about the night everything changed. Not slowly this time. All at once. It was 3 years after Diane moved in. I was 21, in my final year of college, working a part-time job to help cover my own expenses because, by then, Diane had convinced my father that I needed to learn responsibility, which conveniently meant less financial support flowing to me and more flowing toward her plans. That night, I came home late from a study session. I was exhausted, stressed about finals, and all I wanted was to eat something and sleep. When I walked in, I heard raised voices from the kitchen. My father and Diane were arguing, which was rare because Diane usually got her way without needing to raise her voice. I stood in the hallway and listened, and what I heard made my stomach drop. Diane was telling my father that she didn't feel comfortable with me still living in the house. She said I made her feel judged and unwelcome. She said that a father in his 50s shouldn't still be raising a grown daughter, that it was time for me to figure things out on my own, and that our living arrangement was putting a strain on their marriage. I waited for my father to defend me. I waited for him to remind her that this was my home too, the home I grew up in, the home my mother had decorated with her own hands before she passed. I waited for him to say that his daughter would always have a place with him. Instead, I heard him sigh, and then I heard him say the words that changed everything. Maybe you're right. Maybe it's time. I walked into the kitchen before I could stop myself. Both of them turned, startled. My father's face went pale when he realized I had heard. I asked him directly. I said, "Dad, are you asking me to leave?" There was a long silence. Diane's expression was unreadable, almost patient, like a woman who had already won and was simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up. My father looked at me, and then he looked at her, and in that single glance, I understood everything. I understood who he was afraid of losing, and it wasn't me. "I think," he said slowly, "it would be good for you to have your own space. You're an adult now. Diane and I need our own home too." I want you to notice something in that sentence, because I noticed it immediately and it has stayed with me ever since. He called it Diane and I. Not our family. Not our home. Diane and I need our own home. As if I was the guest. As if I was the one who had shown up uninvited 3 years ago, instead of the other way around. I didn't cry in front of them. I want you to know that, because it matters. I had cried enough in my room over the small things. The moved photographs, the interrupted sentences, the birthday he forgot because Diane planned a trip that same week. But this moment, the biggest betrayal of all, I faced with a strange, cold calm. I asked him one more question. I asked, "If Mom were still here, would you be doing this?" He didn't answer, and that silence told me everything I needed to know. I packed a bag that night and left. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have much money. I had a friend from college who let me sleep on her couch for a few weeks while I figured out what to do next. And in those first few nights, lying on a stranger's couch, staring at an unfamiliar ceiling, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't just sadness anymore. Sadness had been there for years, quiet and patient, the way sadness often is. This was something new, something sharper, something that didn't want to cry anymore. It wanted to understand. It wanted to know exactly how deep this betrayal went and exactly why my father had let it happen. Because deep down, even in my grief, I knew something wasn't right. I knew Diane wasn't just a woman who fell in love with my father. There was a coldness to her calculations, a precision to the way she had removed me piece by piece, that felt less like jealousy and more like strategy. Before I left the house that night, there was one more moment I need to tell you about. As I stood at the door with my bag over my shoulder, my father followed me into the hallway. Diane stayed in the kitchen, silent, letting him have this moment, which in itself told me she wasn't worried about what he might say. She trusted him to handle it the way she wanted it handled. My father stood in front of me, and for a second, I thought he might change his mind. I thought he might ask me to stay, tell Diane that this wasn't happening, that his daughter came first. Instead, he reached into his wallet and held out some cash, folded neatly, the way he always folded money, a habit from years of counting out bills for household expenses. "For a hotel," he said, "just until you find something." I looked at that money in his hand for a long moment. And then I did something I'm still, to this day, a little proud of. I didn't take it. "I don't need your money," I told him. "I needed you to choose me." That was all I ever needed. I walked out into the cold that night with nothing but a bag of clothes and a battered old car my mother had left me. And as I drove away, Watching the porch light of my childhood home shrink in the rearview mirror, I made myself a quiet promise. I promised myself I would never again build my sense of worth around whether someone else chose to see it. And that suspicion, that quiet, burning question of why, was the seed of everything that came next. The weeks after I left my father's house were some of the hardest of my life. I want to be honest with you about that, because this isn't a story where the pain magically transforms into strength overnight. Strength doesn't work like that. It's built slowly, in small, unglamorous decisions made on hard days. I finished my final year of college while working 2 part-time jobs. I moved out of my friend's couch and into a tiny studio apartment that I could barely afford, the kind of place where you can hear your neighbors through the walls and the heating never quite works in winter. I ate a lot of instant noodles that year. I learned what it felt like to check my bank account and feel my chest tighten. But here's what I also learned. I learned that I was capable of surviving without my father's approval. And once you learn that, once you truly internalize it, something inside you changes permanently. My father reached out a few times in those early months. Short messages. How are you doing? Let me know if you need anything. Never a real apology. Never an acknowledgement of what he had done. Just enough contact to ease his own guilt, I think, without ever risking Diane's disapproval by doing more. I didn't respond to most of them. Not out of spite. At least, not entirely. But because I didn't have the energy to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. During this time, I threw myself into my studies and, eventually, into my career. I had always been good with numbers, and I found a passion for finance and business strategy that surprised even me. I took on internships that paid almost nothing but taught me everything. I stayed late at the office learning skills my peers didn't bother to learn. I read books on business and negotiation on my lunch breaks instead of scrolling through my phone. Some people, when they've been hurt badly enough, shut down. They stop trying. I understand that response completely, and if that's where you are right now, I want you to know there's no shame in it. But for me, the hurt turned into fuel. Every late night at the office, every skill I mastered, every small promotion I earned, some quiet part of me was thinking about my father. Not in a bitter, obsessive way, but in a determined one. I wanted to build a life so solid, so undeniable, that no one could ever again make me feel small enough to be pushed out of a room. I want to tell you about someone who helped me during this time, because her name deserves to be part of this story. Her name was Rosa, and she was a senior analyst at the first firm that gave me a real chance. Not just an unpaid internship, but an actual paying position. Rosa noticed, I think, that I worked harder than anyone else on the team, and that I never talked about my family, never mentioned holidays with parents, never took the time off that most young employees fought for. One evening, when we were both staying late finishing a report, she asked me directly what had happened. I don't usually talk about it, even now, but something about her steady, non-judgmental patience made me tell her the short version, that my father had chosen his new wife over me, and that I had left with almost nothing. Rosa didn't offer pity, which I appreciated more than I can express. Instead, she told me something I've never forgotten. She said, "The people who hurt us the most usually aren't villains in their own story. They're just weak in a moment that mattered. Your job isn't to make him suffer. Your job is to become someone he was foolish to lose." Then she went back to her spreadsheet like she hadn't just changed the entire direction of how I thought about my pain. I held on to those words through every difficult year that followed. Rosa became something like a mentor to me, teaching me not just the technical skills of financial analysis, but the discipline of patience, the discipline of building something real instead of chasing something fast. 2 years after I left my father's house, I had worked my way up to a junior analyst position at a respected financial firm. It wasn't glamorous. I still lived modestly. But for the first time since my mother passed away, I felt like I was standing on solid ground, built entirely by my own hands. I should tell you a little more about what those early years alone actually looked like, because I think it matters, especially if you're someone going through something similar right now. There was a winter, about a year after I left, when my heating broke in that tiny studio apartment, and I couldn't afford to fix it right away. I remember wearing my coat indoors, wrapping myself in every blanket I owned, studying for a certification exam with my hands so cold I could barely hold my pen steady. I remember thinking, in that moment, how strange it was that just a few miles away, in the house I grew up in, there was warmth and comfort that I had once taken for granted, and I was choosing, actively choosing to freeze in a tiny apartment rather than go back and ask for help. I want to be honest about something. There were nights I almost called him. Nights when the loneliness felt heavier than my pride. When I sat with my phone in my hand, his contact information glowing on the screen, my thumb hovering over the call button. I never made those calls, not during that first hard year. Partly because I was afraid of what I'd hear, that nothing had changed, that Diane still came first, that reaching out would only reopen a wound that was barely beginning to close. And partly because some stubborn part of me needed to prove, to myself more than anyone else, that I could survive without being chosen. I found small sources of strength in unexpected places during that time. My college roommate, the one who let me sleep on her couch during those first difficult weeks, became something like family to me. Her own parents, kind people who barely knew me, started inviting me to their holiday dinners once they learned my situation, never making a big deal of it, just quietly setting an extra plate at the table every Thanksgiving and every winter holiday for 3 years running. I remember sitting at their table one Christmas, surrounded by warmth and laughter that wasn't technically mine, feeling simultaneously grateful and hollow. Grateful for their kindness, hollow because it reminded me of exactly what I was missing from my own family. I also found strength, strangely enough, in the discipline of hard work itself. There's a particular kind of comfort in numbers, in spreadsheets, in problems that have clear, logical solutions if you're patient and careful enough to find them. After a childhood and young adulthood spent trying to decode the emotional puzzle of my father's attention, why did he choose her over me today? What did I do wrong? How can I win back his focus? There was something almost peaceful about work that simply required skill and effort, nothing more complicated than that. If I studied hard enough, I passed the exam. If I worked carefully enough, I caught the errors other analysts missed. Cause and effect, clean and predictable, unlike everything happening at home. By my second year on my own, I had scraped together enough savings to move into a slightly better apartment, one with reliable heating and a landlord who actually returned phone calls. It wasn't much, but after 2 years of counting every dollar, having a space that felt safe and warm felt like an enormous victory. I remember standing in that new apartment on moving day, looking around at the bare walls, and crying, not out of sadness this time, but out of something closer to pride. I had built this, every piece of it, with my own hands, without anyone's permission or approval. And it was during this time, almost by accident, that I first heard the name that would change everything. I was working on a due diligence project for my firm, reviewing financial records for a mid-sized business that was seeking investment. It was routine work, the kind of thing junior analysts do without much excitement. But when I opened the file and saw the name of the business owner's spouse listed as a co-signer on several loans, my hands went still on the keyboard. The name was Diane. Not a common enough name for me to assume it was a coincidence. And when I looked closer at the details, the city, the age, small identifying information scattered through the documents, my stomach dropped in a way I hadn't felt since the night I left my father's house. Because what I found in those financial records wasn't just my father's new wife's name. It was the first thread of a much bigger story. A story about who Diane really was, long before she ever met my father. And once I started pulling on that thread, I couldn't stop. I want to pause here and be very clear about something, because it matters for the rest of this story. What I'm about to describe was not some elaborate spy operation. I wasn't hacking into anything. I wasn't breaking any laws. What I did was something far simpler and, in some ways, far more powerful. I paid attention. I asked questions. I followed publicly available information with the same careful patience I had learned to apply to my work. The loan documents I had come across at my job were for a different case entirely, completely unrelated to my father. But seeing Diane's name attached to a financial history I had never known about lit a spark of curiosity I couldn't ignore. That night, after work, I sat at my small kitchen table with my laptop, and I began to search. What I found, piece by piece over the following weeks, painted a very different picture of Diane than the one she had presented to my father. Diane had been married twice before meeting my father. I want to say clearly, being married more than once is not a crime, and it says nothing bad about a person on its own. But the pattern I found in public records, court filings, and old business registrations was unsettling in a very specific way. Both of her previous marriages had ended not long after her husband's experienced significant financial setbacks that, in both cases, coincided with major assets being transferred into accounts and properties under Diane's name. In her first marriage, her husband had owned a small but successful chain of hardware stores. Within 4 years of marrying Diane, the business had taken on debt it never recovered from. Several properties had been sold, and the proceeds moved into accounts Diane controlled, and the marriage ended in a divorce that left her ex-husband with almost nothing. He passed away a few years later, according to an old newspaper obituary I found, in reduced circumstances that seemed to contrast sharply with the successful business he had once run. Her second marriage followed an eerily similar shape. A man who had inherited a modest but valuable piece of land from his family. Within 3 years of marrying Diane, the land had been sold, the proceeds restructured through a series of investments that primarily benefited accounts in Diane's name, and the marriage ended shortly after. I sat back from my laptop that night and felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature in my apartment. This wasn't a woman who fell in love with my grieving father because she was drawn to his kindness or his stability. This was a pattern. A calculated, repeated pattern of finding vulnerable men. Men who had recently lost something. Men who were emotionally exposed. Men who were eager for comfort. And slowly, methodically restructuring their lives and finances until there was very little left for anyone but her. And my father fit that pattern perfectly. A grieving widower. A steady income. A modest but valuable family home that my mother and father had paid off years before she passed. A daughter who, if removed from the picture, would leave my father entirely dependent on Diane for companionship and decision-making. I remember sitting at my kitchen table at nearly 2 in the morning, surrounded by printed court records and old newspaper clippings, my coffee gone cold hours before. I kept a notebook during this process, not out of some dramatic instinct for evidence gathering, but because I needed somewhere to organize my racing thoughts. In that notebook, I drew a simple timeline. Marriage 1. Financial transfer. Divorce. Marriage 2. Financial transfer. Divorce. And now my father. I stared at that timeline for a long time, tracing the pattern with my finger, feeling the shape of it settle into my chest like a stone. I thought about the man from her first marriage, the one who had owned the hardware stores, the one whose obituary described him as living out his final years in a small rented apartment, far from the life he had built. I wondered if he had ever figured out what happened to him. I wondered if he had died still confused, still telling himself some version of the story where it had simply been bad luck rather than a plan. I felt sick, not just because of what this meant for my father's finances, though that concerned me deeply. I felt sick because I finally understood why she had worked so hard, so patiently, to push me out of that house. It was never really about jealousy or discomfort, the reasons she gave my father that night in the kitchen. It was about isolation. A daughter who remembered her mother, who understood the family's history, who might one day ask hard questions about missing photographs or shifting finances. That daughter was a threat to her plan. And she had eliminated that threat with the patience of someone who had done this before. I thought about my father, alone in that house now with a woman who saw him not as a partner, but as an asset to be slowly, carefully drained. And for the first time since I left that house 2 years earlier, I felt something other than grief when I thought about him. I felt fear for him. And underneath that fear, a fierce, protective anger began to grow. This is the part of the story where many people would say the desire for revenge began. And maybe that's true, in part. But I want to be honest with you about what I actually felt in that moment. It wasn't a desire to destroy Diane out of anger for what she had done to me. It was something closer to a desperate need to save my father from what I now believed she was planning to do to him. Even though he had chosen her over me. Even though he had let me walk out of that house without a real fight. Because here is something I learned in those years away from him. Love doesn't disappear just because it's been hurt. It goes quiet. It waits. And sometimes, it comes back stronger than before, wearing a different face. Not the face of a daughter begging to be let back in, but the face of someone determined to protect the people she loves, whether they deserve it or not. I made a decision that night. I wasn't going to storm into that house and make accusations I couldn't prove. I wasn't going to warn my father directly, not yet, because I knew from the pattern I'd uncovered that Diane was skilled, dangerously skilled, at making herself look like the victim whenever her methods were questioned. If I went to my father with vague suspicions and no proof, she would simply spin it as jealousy, as bitterness, as a daughter who couldn't accept her father's new happiness. No, if I was going to help him, I needed proof. Real, undeniable proof. And to get that, I needed to be patient, careful, and smart. I needed a plan. Revenge, I learned, is not usually a single dramatic act. Real revenge, the kind that actually works, the kind that exposes the truth instead of just satisfying anger for a moment, is built slowly, carefully, out of patience and precision. Over the following year, I approached this the same way I approached my work, methodically, and without letting emotion cloud my judgment. The first thing I did was continue building my career. This wasn't just about proving myself anymore. It was strategic. The more knowledge I gained about finance, contracts, and asset protection, the better equipped I would be to understand exactly what Diane might be doing to my father's finances and exactly how to help him protect what remained. I earned a professional certification in financial analysis. I moved to a slightly larger firm, one that specialized in forensic accounting, the kind of work that involves carefully tracing money through complicated financial structures to figure out where it actually goes and whether anything improper has happened along the way. It was, in many ways, exactly the skill set I needed. At the same time, I began quietly reconnecting with people from my father's life. Not Diane. Old friends of my father's, people from his workplace, a cousin who had always been kind to me growing up. I didn't ask them directly about Diane's finances. That would have raised suspicion and possibly gotten back to her. Instead, I simply stayed present. I asked how my father was doing. I let people talk, the way people naturally do when someone shows genuine interest. And slowly, through these conversations, I began to piece together a picture of what had happened to my father's life since I left. My father had retired earlier than he had ever planned to, according to his old coworker. Diane had convinced him that with her business connections, they didn't need his salary, that he deserved to relax after all his years of hard work. His retirement savings, once carefully managed, had been moved into new investments that Diane had recommended, managed by a financial advisor who, I later discovered, was a close personal friend of hers. The family home, my childhood home, the one my mother had decorated with her own hands, had been used as collateral for a loan tied to one of Diane's business ventures, a boutique consulting firm that, from everything I could find, had no real clients and no real revenue. Just money flowing in from my father's assets and very little flowing back out except into accounts I couldn't yet fully trace. I want to pause here and tell you something important. Throughout this entire process, I never once broke the law. I never accessed anything I wasn't entitled to access. Everything I found came from public records, from conversations, from the kind of careful attention that anyone could pay if they cared enough to look. This matters, because when the truth finally came out, it needed to be undeniable, not something that could be dismissed as illegally obtained or personally biased. It took me nearly 18 months to build a complete picture. 18 months of careful, patient work, done quietly while I continued building my own career and my own life. During this time, I limited contact with my father to occasional, brief messages, enough to maintain a thread of connection, not enough to raise Diane's suspicion that anything was happening beneath the surface. By the end of those 18 months, I had assembled something powerful, a clear financial trail showing exactly how Diane had systematically moved my father's assets, his retirement savings, the equity in the family home, even a small inheritance that had come from my mother's side of the family, into structures that primarily benefited her and her consulting business. Structures that would leave my father with very little if their marriage were to end, whether by divorce or by other means. But knowing the truth wasn't enough. I needed my father to see it too. And more than that, because of everything Diane had done to isolate him, to make him doubt his own instincts, to make him doubt me, I needed him to see it in a way he couldn't dismiss, couldn't explain away, couldn't be talked out of by Diane's practiced reassurances. During those 18 months, I also made a point of learning everything I could about how people like Diane typically responded when confronted. I read case studies of financial exploitation, particularly cases involving spouses who isolated elderly or vulnerable partners from their families. I learned that confrontation without airtight proof almost always backfired. The manipulator would simply reframe the accuser as jealous, unstable, or vindictive, And in many cases, the very act of raising concerns pushed the vulnerable partner closer to the manipulator, not further away, because it made the manipulator's narrative of everyone is against us feel true. This terrified me, because I understood that if I moved too early, too emotionally, I could do more harm than good. I could hand Diane exactly the ammunition she needed to paint me as the villain of this story instead of her. So I forced myself to slow down, even when every instinct in me wanted to call my father immediately and tell him everything I suspected. I needed a moment. A single, undeniable moment where the truth would be impossible to ignore. And as it turned out, that moment was coming, whether I orchestrated it or not. Because while I had been quietly building my case, Diane had been growing bolder, confident that she had successfully removed every obstacle in her path. My mother gone, me pushed out, my father isolated and dependent. She had begun making a mistake that people who believe they've won often make. She had started to get careless. There's something people don't tell you about uncovering a hidden truth. The hardest part isn't finding it. The hardest part is learning to present it in a way that can't be argued away. During this period, I spent my weekends doing something that might sound strange for someone in their early 20s. I sat in on public court proceedings. Divorce and financial dispute cases are, in most places, a matter of public record, and many hearings are open to anyone who wants to sit quietly in the back of the room and watch. I wanted to understand, firsthand, how financial manipulation cases were actually argued, what kind of evidence judges took seriously, what kind of testimony fell apart under simple, careful questioning, and what kind of documentation was considered undeniable versus merely suspicious. I watched one case in particular that affected me deeply. A woman, much older than me, sat in the witness stand trying to explain how her late husband's business partner had slowly taken control of assets that should have gone to her and her children. She was clearly telling the truth. I could see it in the way her hands shook, in the specific, painful details she remembered. But her case fell apart because she had no paper trail, no documents, just her word against a man who had covered his tracks carefully. The judge, sympathetic but bound by the law, ruled against her for lack of evidence. I left that courtroom shaken and more determined than ever. I understood, watching that woman lose everything for lack of proof, exactly what I needed to build for my father. Not suspicion, not stories, not even a compelling narrative. I needed documents, dates, signatures, numbers that added up in a way no lawyer, however skilled, could successfully argue away. So I changed my approach. Instead of simply gathering information about Diane's past, I began requesting official copies of public records through the proper legal channels, property deeds, court filings from her previous divorces, business registration documents for her consulting company. Everything I gathered through legitimate means, with dates and sources carefully logged, because I knew that if this information was ever going to matter, it needed to survive scrutiny. I also began, carefully and anonymously, researching the financial advisor Diane relied on so heavily. The man I would later learn was her former brother-in-law. Business registration records are public in most places, and it didn't take long to find the connection between his firm and Diane's first marriage. I found old business filings listing him as an officer in a company associated with her first husband's hardware store chain, filed the same year that business began its decline. The pattern I had suspected was now something I could actually point to, in writing, with dates attached. I remember the night I finally organized everything into a single, coherent file. I printed it all out and laid it across my small kitchen table, section by section, the way I imagined a lawyer might lay out a case. Marriage 1, with supporting documents. Marriage 2, with supporting documents. My father's situation, mapped against the same pattern, with every transfer, every loan, every property change dated and sourced. I sat back and looked at that table, covered edge to edge with paper, and felt something settle in my chest. Not triumph. It never felt like triumph, not once through this entire process. It felt more like relief. The relief of finally holding something solid in my hands after years of being told, in 1,000 small ways, that what I felt and what I saw wasn't real. I called Rosa that night, the mentor who had told me, years earlier, that my job wasn't to make my father suffer, but to become someone he was foolish to lose. I told her what I had found. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, And then she said something I've never forgotten. "You didn't just build a case," she told me. "You built a mirror. Now all that's left is showing him his own reflection." I didn't act immediately, even with everything assembled. I waited for the right moment. Not because I enjoyed waiting, but because I understood, by then, that timing mattered as much as truth. A truth delivered too early, before someone is ready to see it, often gets rejected simply because the timing feels like an attack. I needed my father to be in a place where he could actually hear what I had to say, rather than a place where hearing it would only make him retreat further into Diane's version of reality. As it turned out, I wouldn't have to wait much longer, because while I had been carefully building my case, cracks were already beginning to form on their own. Cracks that had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with the fact that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually strain under their own weight. There's an old truth about people who manipulate others for a long time without ever being caught. Eventually, they start to believe they're untouchable. And that belief, more than any outside investigation, is usually what brings them down. About 20 months after I began looking into Diane's history, I received an unexpected phone call. It was my father's cousin, the one who had always been kind to me, the one I had stayed quietly close to during my time away. She called me in a state of distress, and what she told me confirmed that Diane's carefully controlled world was beginning to crack. According to my father's cousin, Diane's consulting business, the one my father's retirement savings and home equity had been quietly funneled into, had failed to secure a major contract it was counting on. Without that contract, the business had no way to generate the revenue it needed to make it look, from the outside, like a legitimate operation. Diane had apparently begun pressuring my father for more money, more aggressively than she had before, to keep things afloat until the business could recover. My father, according to his cousin, had started asking questions. Small ones at first. Where exactly was the money going? Why did the business never seem to have any actual clients? Why did the financial advisor Diane trusted so completely keep recommending investments that Diane always seemed to benefit from? My father's cousin told me something else that stayed with me. She said that at a recent family gathering, Diane had made an offhand comment about how some people just aren't cut out for business, and it's a good thing there are people around who know how to manage money properly. She said it lightly, laughing, but my father's cousin noticed my father's face fall, just slightly, in a way that suggested the comment had landed somewhere deeper than Diane probably intended. It struck me, hearing this, that Diane's confidence had started to curdle into something closer to contempt. When people believe they've fully won, they often stop bothering to hide how they really feel about the people they've beaten. That single comment told me more about where things stood than any financial document could have. This was the opening I had been waiting for. Not because I wanted my father to suffer through financial stress. Quite the opposite. I wanted him to have the tools to understand what was happening before it was too late. Because from the financial trail I had built, I knew something my father didn't yet fully grasp. If Diane's business failed completely, and she needed to cover the losses, the family home, my mother's home, was the primary asset standing between her and financial ruin. And I suspected, based on the structure of the loans I had traced, that Diane had already positioned herself so that if anything happened to my father, health problems, or worse, she would have far more control over that asset than my father probably realized. I made a decision. It was time to reach out directly. I didn't call my father. I wrote him a letter, an old-fashioned, handwritten letter, because I wanted him to have something physical, something he could hold and reread, something that couldn't be deleted or dismissed with a quick reply the way a text message could be. I wrote about missing him. I wrote about understanding, now, as an adult, that grief had made him vulnerable in ways he probably still didn't fully see. I told him, gently but clearly, that I had come across some information about Diane's financial history that concerned me deeply, and that I wasn't asking him to believe me blindly. I was asking for the chance to sit down with him and show him everything, so he could decide for himself what it meant. I sent that letter not knowing if he would respond at all. 3 days later, my phone rang. It was my father's number, the first time he had called me directly in almost 3 years. His voice, when I answered, sounded smaller than I remembered. Tired. Uncertain. He said 4 words that I will never forget as long as I live. I need to see you. We agreed to meet at a small coffee shop, neutral ground, away from the house and away from Diane. I remember sitting in my car outside that coffee shop for almost 10 minutes before I went in, my hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. Part of me wanted to walk in and unleash 3 years of hurt onto him. Every missed birthday, every interrupted sentence, every moment he chose her comfort over my presence. But I reminded myself why I was there. Not to punish him, to help him see clearly, maybe for the first time in years. When I walked in, I almost didn't recognize him. My father had always been a solid, steady presence, a man who filled a room just by standing in it. The man sitting at that corner table looked smaller, older than his years, tired in a way that went beyond simple exhaustion. He stood up when he saw me, and for a moment, neither of us knew what to do. Then he pulled me into a hug, and I felt him shaking slightly, and I understood, in that moment, that some part of him had been waiting for this too. We sat down, and I didn't waste time with small talk. I had brought a folder with me, printed copies of everything I had found. Property records, loan documents, the pattern from Diane's 2 previous marriages, the structure of her failing consulting business, and exactly how it connected to his retirement accounts and the equity in their home. I slid the folder across the table and I said, "Dad, I need you to look at this. All of it. And I need you to know that I'm not showing you this because I'm angry at you, even though I have been for a long time. I'm showing you this because I'm scared for you, and because no matter what happened between us, you're still my father, and I couldn't stay quiet knowing what I know." He opened that folder with visibly shaking hands, and I watched, over the next 20 minutes, as my father's face went through an entire silent journey. Confusion, then disbelief, then a dawning, horrified recognition, and finally, something that looked almost like grief. He recognized some of what was in that folder already, pieces he had started to suspect on his own. But seeing the full pattern laid out, seeing, in black and white, exactly how much of his life savings, exactly how much of the home he had built with my mother had been quietly restructured to benefit Diane and her failing business, broke something open in him. He asked me, in a voice barely above a whisper, "How long have you known?" I told him the truth. Almost 2 years. I told him why I hadn't come to him sooner. Because I needed proof strong enough that Diane couldn't simply talk her way around it, the way she had talked her way around every small concern he'd ever raised before. And then he said something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. He looked up from that folder, his eyes wet, and he said, "I chose her over you. I let you walk out of that house, and you still came back to save me. What kind of father does that make me? And what kind of daughter does that make you?" I didn't have an easy answer for him. I still don't, if I'm honest. But I told him what I believed to be true, that people can make terrible mistakes out of grief and loneliness, and that making a mistake doesn't erase the love that existed before it. What matters, I told him, is what you do once you finally see clearly. We sat in that coffee shop for almost 3 hours. At one point, he reached across the table and took my hand, something he hadn't done since I was a little girl. He asked me questions about the years he had missed, where I was working, what my apartment looked like, whether I was happy. Small questions, the kind a father should have been asking all along, and each one felt like a small repair to something that had been broken for a long time. He also asked me, quietly, why I had kept trying after everything, why I hadn't simply let him deal with the consequences of his own choices. I thought about that question for a long moment before I answered. "Because you're my father," I told him, "and because somewhere in all of this, I never stopped hoping you'd wake up. I just didn't know if you ever would." He cried, right there in that coffee shop, not caring who saw. I hadn't seen my father cry since my mother's funeral. And in that moment, whatever anger I had carried for 3 years didn't disappear completely. Grief that deep doesn't disappear all at once. But it softened, just enough to make room for something else. Something that felt, cautiously, like hope. He asked me what he should do next. And for the first time in years, my father was asking me, not Diane, for guidance. What happened over the next few months moved faster than I expected, and in some ways, slower than I hoped, because untangling a financial web that had been carefully built over 3 years doesn't happen overnight, especially when you're trying to do it carefully, legally, and without giving the other person a chance to hide what remains. My father, once he saw the truth clearly, moved with a determination I hadn't seen in him since before my mother passed away. He quietly consulted a lawyer, a real one, independent of Diane's circle of trusted advisors. He began gathering his own documentation, cross-referencing it with what I had found, building an even fuller picture of exactly how deep Diane's financial restructuring had gone. During this period, my father and I spoke almost daily, something that hadn't happened in years. Each conversation added another layer to the picture. A phone call after he met with his lawyer, a message after he found an old document he hadn't understood the significance of until now, a late-night call simply because he needed to talk through his fear of what he might discover next. I remember one call in particular, about 6 weeks into this process, when my father told me he had found a folder in Diane's home office, tucked behind other files, containing paperwork related to her first marriage that he had never seen before, documents that matched almost exactly the pattern I had shown him in that coffee shop. He said his hands were shaking so badly when he found it that he had to sit down on the floor of the office, right there, and just breathe for several minutes before he could continue reading. "It's one thing to be told," he said to me that night, his voice hoarse. "It's another thing to hold the proof in your own hands, in her own handwriting, in the house I let her live in for 3 years." I understood exactly what he meant. There's a particular kind of pain in discovering that someone you trusted left evidence of their patterns in plain sight, simply because they never imagined you'd be paying close enough attention to find it. What they discovered was worse than even I had suspected. Diane's consulting business wasn't just failing. It had essentially never been a real, functioning business at all. It existed primarily as a vehicle to receive transfers from my father's accounts and funnel them into investments and properties held solely in Diane's name, managed by her longtime financial advisor, who, as it turned out, was not simply a friend. He was her former brother-in-law from her first marriage, the same marriage where a similar pattern of asset transfers had occurred. Diane had no idea, during those months, that my father knew what she had done. My father, to his credit, played his part carefully. He continued behaving normally at home, giving no outward sign that anything had changed, while quietly working with his lawyer to secure what remained of his and my mother's assets. Most importantly, protecting the family home from being used as collateral for any further loans, and beginning the careful legal process of separating his finances from Diane's control. I want to be honest with you about something important. This wasn't really my revenge story in the dramatic sense you might be expecting. I didn't confront Diane myself. I didn't stage some big, cinematic showdown. The real turning point was quieter and, in some ways, more powerful than that. It was my father, finally, choosing to see clearly, and finally choosing to act to protect himself and what remained of our family's legacy. The confrontation, when it finally came, happened in our old family kitchen, the same kitchen where, years earlier, my father had told me it was time for me to leave. My father had asked me to be there, not to fight his battle for him, but because, in his words, "You're the one who found the truth. You deserve to see this through." When Diane came home that evening and found both of us sitting at the kitchen table, with the lawyer's documentation spread out between us, her expression flickered, just for a moment, with something like panic before settling back into the calm, controlled mask she always wore. She tried every tool in the arsenal that had worked on my father for years. She tried gentle reassurance, telling him he was misunderstanding complicated financial matters. When that didn't work, she tried to make herself the victim, accusing him of letting his resentful daughter poison his mind against her. When that didn't work either, her tone shifted, sharper, colder, a version of Diane I don't think my father had ever seen directed at him before, though I suspected it was closer to who she really was underneath the charm. But my father, for the first time in years, did not back down. He told her, calmly but firmly, that he had seen the documentation for himself. He told her that he knew about her 2 previous marriages, about the pattern that had repeated itself in his own life. He told her that he had already begun the legal process to protect the family home and separate his remaining assets from her control. "You ungrateful old fool," she finally said, her voice dropping into something flat and hard, all pretense of warmth gone. "Everything I did to give you a comfortable life. And this is how you repay it? Believing your bitter daughter's fairy tales over your own wife." My father, to my surprise, didn't flinch. He looked at her steadily and said, "I've seen bank statements, Diane. Property transfers. 2 other marriages that ended the exact same way mine is about to. I'm not choosing my daughter's story over yours. I'm choosing the truth over a story you told me for 3 years." Diane turned to me then, and for the first time since I'd known her, She dropped every pretense of warmth entirely. You couldn't just let him be happy, she said. You couldn't stand that he chose someone else, so you had to destroy it. I met her eyes without flinching. He didn't choose you, I said quietly. He chose comfort. And you knew exactly how to sell it to him. But comfort built on a lie always runs out eventually. I didn't destroy anything, Diane. I just turned the lights on. Diane's mask fully slipped, just for a moment. And in that moment, I saw the woman underneath the charm, cold, calculating, furious at being caught rather than remorseful for what she had done. She left the house that night. Not because my father asked her to, but because she understood, with the same cold calculation she had always used, that there was nothing left to gain by staying. After the door closed behind her, the house fell into a silence unlike anything I had experienced there in years. My father sat down slowly at the kitchen table, the same table where, years earlier, he had told me it was time for me to leave, and he put his head in his hands. I didn't know, in that moment, whether to comfort him or give him space, so I did what felt right. I sat down across from him and stayed quiet, letting him process everything that had just happened at his own pace. After a long while, he looked up at me, his eyes red, and said something that I think about often. 3 years, he said. 3 years I let that woman convince me my own daughter was the problem. 3 years I chose comfort over the truth, because the truth was harder to face. He shook his head slowly. I don't know how to ask you to forgive that. I don't think I would if I were you. I didn't have an easy response for him. I still don't think there was an easy response to give. What I told him, instead, was that forgiveness wasn't something that needed to be decided that night, in the wreckage of everything that had just happened. I told him that what mattered right now was making sure he was safe, making sure what remained of his life and his savings was protected, and that the question of forgiveness could wait until we both had the distance to think about it clearly. He nodded, and for the first time in years, I saw something in his face that looked like genuine relief. Not because the pain was over, but because, finally, after 3 years of confusion and manipulation, he understood exactly what had happened to him. Sometimes clarity, even painful clarity, is its own kind of relief after living so long in a fog someone else created for you. The months that followed were not simple, and I don't want to pretend they were. Untangling a marriage, especially one built on financial manipulation, takes time. There were lawyers, negotiations, and difficult conversations. Diane fought to keep as much as she could, but with the clear documentation my father and I had assembled, legally obtained, carefully organized, impossible to dismiss as mere suspicion, the outcome was never seriously in doubt. In the end, my father was able to protect the family home. He recovered a significant portion of his retirement savings, though not all of it. Some had already been lost in Diane's failing business ventures, money that, realistically, would never be fully recovered. The consulting business itself, once its true nature was investigated more closely by my father's lawyer, drew the attention of financial authorities, given the pattern of transfers involved. I won't go into the legal specifics here, because that part of the story isn't really mine to tell in detail. What matters is that Diane's carefully constructed world, the one she had built by finding grieving, vulnerable men and slowly draining what they had built over a lifetime, finally came apart under the weight of its own history. For my father, the emotional aftermath was, in many ways, harder than the financial recovery. He had to sit with the reality of what he had allowed to happen, not just to his finances, but to me. He had to face the fact that in choosing comfort and companionship over protecting his own daughter, he had nearly lost everything: his home, his security, and very nearly, his relationship with me. We talked, during those months, more honestly than we had in years. He apologized, not the small, deflecting apologies he had offered in his occasional messages during my years away, but a real one. He told me that grief had made him desperate for someone to fill the silence my mother left behind, and that Diane had been skilled at making that silence feel less painful, at least on the surface. He told me that somewhere along the way, he had convinced himself that keeping the peace with her mattered more than standing up for me, because he was terrified of being alone again. I told him that his fear made sense to me, even if the choices that came from it had hurt me deeply. I told him that I understood grief could make people do things they never thought they were capable of. But I also told him, clearly, that understanding wasn't the same as excusing, and that if we were going to rebuild anything real between us, It needed to be built on honesty, not on avoiding hard truths the way he had avoided them for years. It wasn't an instant fix. Trust, once broken as deeply as ours had been, doesn't rebuild itself overnight, no matter how sincere the apology. We started slowly. Weekly phone calls, occasional dinners, first in public places, neutral ground, before we were ready to sit together again in that kitchen without the weight of everything that had happened there. I remember one evening, a few months into this slow rebuilding, when my father asked if he could come see my apartment for the first time. It was small, nothing special, but I had made it mine, photographs on the walls, including one of my mother that I had kept safe through every hard year. My father stood in front of that photograph for a long time, quiet, before turning to me and saying, "You built all of this yourself." While I was busy losing everything I already had, I didn't have a response for that. I just made him a cup of tea, the way my mother used to, and we sat together in comfortable silence, something we hadn't shared in years. Eventually, my father sold the family home. Not because he was forced to, but because, as he told me one evening over dinner, too many painful memories lived in those walls now, not just from Diane, but from the years he had let himself drift away from the daughter who had once helped him survive my mother's passing. He moved into a smaller place, simpler, a fresh start built on more solid ground than the one he'd built with Diane. And slowly, carefully, we became something close to a family again. Not the same as before, too much had happened for that, but something real, something honest. A year after that night in the kitchen, my father called me on a Sunday morning, just to talk. No emergency, no document to review, no crisis to manage. Just a father calling his daughter because he wanted to hear her voice. It had become, by then, something like a ritual between us. Sunday morning calls, sometimes short, sometimes lasting an hour, catching each other up on the small, ordinary details of life that we had missed out on for so many years. He told me about his new apartment, how strange it felt at first to live somewhere that held no memories, good or bad, and how that strangeness had slowly turned into something he described as peaceful. I told him about a promotion I had earned at work, moving from junior analyst to a senior position on the forensic accounting team, a role that, in a strange twist I still find meaningful, now involved helping other families untangle exactly the kind of financial manipulation that had once been used against him. He asked me, during one of those calls, if I had ever forgiven him. It was a hard question, and I didn't answer it quickly because I wanted to give him an honest answer rather than an easy one. I told him that forgiveness, for me, hadn't come as a single moment. It had come slowly, the same way trust rebuilds, through consistency, through him showing up for the small things, week after week, the way he used to before grief and loneliness pulled him somewhere else. I told him that I didn't forgive him because he deserved it automatically, but because I had watched him work to deserve it, and that mattered more to me than any single apology ever could. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I don't think I ever really understood what it cost you to keep coming back, even when I gave you every reason to stay away." I told him that it had cost me more than he probably knew. Years of unresolved anger, nights spent wondering if I had made the right choice by staying involved in his life at all, moments of real doubt about whether he would ever truly see what had happened. But I also told him that walking away completely, letting him face the consequences of Diane's manipulation entirely alone, was never something I could have lived with. Not because he was owed my help, but because that simply wasn't who I wanted to be. We talked, too, about my mother, more openly than we had in years. My father told me that in the quiet of his new apartment, without Diane's constant presence filling every silence, he had finally allowed himself to properly grieve my mother, something he admitted he had rushed past in his hurry to fill the emptiness she left behind. He told me he visited her grave more often now, that he talked to her sometimes, told her about the mistakes he'd made and the daughter who had, despite everything, refused to give up on their family. I want to tell you about the financial recovery too, because I think it matters for anyone listening to this who might be facing something similar. My father never recovered everything Diane's scheme had cost him. Some of the retirement savings were gone for good, absorbed into the failed consulting business and the investments managed by her former brother-in-law, which, once fully investigated, turned out to be far less legitimate than they appeared. But he recovered enough. Enough to live comfortably. Enough to feel secure again. And more importantly, He recovered something that no amount of money could have restored on its own, a clear understanding of who truly stood beside him when everything else fell away. As for Diane, I heard, through the same channels that had once given me her financial history, that she resurfaced in a different city about a year after leaving my father's life, already connected to another man, a recently widowed business owner, according to the brief information I came across. I won't pretend I don't think about him sometimes, that unknown man who has no idea what pattern he might be walking into. Part of me wanted to warn him, the way I wish someone had warned my father. But I also understood, by then, that this wasn't a battle I could fight for every stranger in the world. All I could do was make sure the people closest to me were protected and trust that the truth, once exposed in one place, has a way of eventually catching up with people who rely on hiding it. I've told you a lot in this story, about betrayal, about patience, about the quiet, careful work of uncovering a truth that someone worked very hard to hide. But before we close this chapter, I want to share with you what I actually learned from all of it, because I think it matters more than the details of Diane's scheme or the specifics of how it all unraveled. The first thing I learned is that grief makes people vulnerable in ways they often don't recognize in themselves. My father wasn't a bad man. He was a broken one, trying to fill an unbearable silence. And he made choices in that brokenness that hurt the people who loved him most. If there's someone in your life who has hurt you while grieving, I'm not asking you to excuse what they did. But I am asking you to consider, as I eventually did, that hurt people often make choices from fear, not from malice, and understanding that difference can be the first step toward healing, if healing is something you choose to pursue. The second thing I learned is that real strength rarely looks like the dramatic revenge we see in movies. It doesn't come from screaming matches or public humiliation. It comes from patience. It comes from building your own life so solidly that no one can shake it out from under you again. It comes from gathering the truth carefully, methodically, until it becomes undeniable, not because you want to destroy someone, but because you refuse to let a lie stand unchallenged. The third thing I learned, and maybe the most important one, is that walking away from a toxic situation is not the same as giving up on the people you love. I left my father's house because I had to protect myself, but leaving didn't mean I stopped caring what happened to him. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is to step back, build your own strength, and then come back, not as someone begging to be let back in, but as someone strong enough to help on your own terms. And finally, I learned that people like Diane, people who make a pattern out of finding vulnerable, grieving people and slowly taking everything they have, rely on one thing above all else: silence. They rely on the people around them being too afraid, too tired, or too unwilling to look closely at the truth. The moment someone refuses to stay silent, the moment someone starts asking careful, patient questions and following the answers wherever they lead, that pattern becomes impossible to hide. If you're watching this and you recognize even a piece of your own story in mine, a parent who chose someone else over you, a family member manipulated by someone who seemed too good to be true, a truth you've been afraid to look at too closely, I want you to know this: you are not powerless. The quiet work of patience, of building your own strength, of gathering truth instead of just anger, is more powerful than any dramatic confrontation could ever be. My father chose his new wife over me. For a long time, that choice nearly cost him everything he had left. But in the end, it was the daughter he pushed away who came back to save him. Not because she owed him anything, but because love, even wounded love, doesn't disappear as easily as people think. It just waits, quietly, patiently, for the moment it's needed most. I think often about the version of this story where things went differently. A version where I never came across that loan document at work, never noticed Diane's name, never pulled on that first thread. In that version, my father might still be living in that house, slowly losing everything, never understanding why his retirement savings kept shrinking, never questioning the woman he trusted so completely. I think about that unnamed man from Diane's first marriage, the one who died in reduced circumstances, still confused, still believing his misfortune was simply bad luck. I think about how easily my father could have become that same sad ending to someone else's pattern. That thought is part of why I chose to share this story at all. Not for sympathy, and not, despite what the title of this story might suggest, purely for the satisfaction of seeing my father regret his choice. Regret, when it finally came, wasn't sweet the way I once imagined it might be. Watching my father's face crumble as he understood what he had done, to himself and to me, was one of the hardest things I've ever witnessed. There was no triumph in that moment. Only grief, for both of us, for the years we had lost that we could never fully get back. If I could go back and change anything, I don't know that I would choose differently. I don't know that I could have saved him any other way, given who Diane was and how skilled she had become at rewriting reality for the people around her. But I do wish, more than anything, that it hadn't taken a scheme this deep, this damaging, for him to finally see clearly. I wish he had trusted his own instincts sooner. I wish, most of all, that he had chosen me, not out of obligation, but out of simple, uncomplicated love, long before any of this became necessary. But we don't get to choose the lessons that finally break through to the people we love. We only get to choose how we respond when those lessons finally arrive. My father responded, in the end, with honesty and effort, and that mattered more than I can express. Not every story like this ends that way. Some people, even when shown undeniable proof, choose to stay in the comfortable lie rather than face an uncomfortable truth. If that happens to you, if the person you're trying to protect refuses to see what's right in front of them, please know that it is not a reflection of your worth or the strength of the truth you carried. Some people simply aren't ready to hear it, no matter how carefully or patiently you deliver it. Protecting yourself in that situation isn't giving up. It's survival, and it's just as valid a choice as staying to fight. If this story meant something to you, sit with it for a moment before you go. And if you've ever had to rebuild yourself after someone you trusted chose someone else over you, I hope you find, as I did, that the life you build afterward can be stronger than anything you left behind. If you've made it this far, I want to leave you with one last thought. Families are not defined by the absence of mistakes. Every family, even the closest ones, is built by imperfect people who sometimes choose wrong, who sometimes let fear or loneliness or grief lead them somewhere they shouldn't go. What defines a family, in the end, isn't the mistake itself. It's what happens afterward. Whether there's enough love left on both sides to look honestly at what went wrong and choose, deliberately, to build something better from the wreckage. My father chose wrong for 3 years. But in the end, he chose to see the truth, to face it, and to do the hard work of earning back a relationship he had nearly thrown away. And I chose, even after everything, to give him the chance to do that. Neither of those choices erases what happened. But together, they gave us something neither of us thought we'd have again. Each other, honestly, without illusions, without someone standing between us controlling what we were allowed to see. If there's someone in your life who chose comfort over you, someone who let you walk away without a fight, I won't tell you what to do with that pain, because only you know what your relationship can bear. But I will tell you this: build your own life first. Build it so solidly that no one's choice about you can ever again determine your worth. And if the door ever opens for reconciliation, you'll walk through it not as someone begging to be chosen, but as someone strong enough to decide, on your own terms, whether that person still deserves a place in your story. Thank you for staying with me until the end.